Dear friends, it's a great honor to have the colleagues from the Haifa Center for European and German Studies with us today in this CDEA Porto Alegre conference. Our subject is the effect of COVID-19 on migrants and asylum seekers, European and Brazilian response. And I am Claudia Lima Marques, Director of the Center of European and German Studies from Porto Alegre, Brazil. And I will be the chair together with Catarina Konared from the Haifa Center. Welcome, Catarina. And we have today two presenters from our two centers, Professor Dr. Tatiana Squeff from the Federal University of Uberlândia, and Danni Reches, PhD candidate from the Haifa Center. Thank you very much for this idea. And the idea, it was also made together with some students, and I want to thank especially Marcela Joelsen, Maria Fluck, and Guilherme Musselin, and to present our speakers from today, I will give the floor to Marcela Joelsen first. Oh, sorry, I should give the floor to Catarina, our co-chair. Sorry, I'm so used to be the only chair that I missed this. Catarina, please.
No problem. So thank you very much, Claudia, for the nice introduction. And also I will just continue the line of thinking because I know that your center put a lot of work into it. I have very good memories of us meeting almost 1 year ago to a summer school in Brazil where we all still had the possibility to meet physically. And this is where all these debates were born and these ideas were born, right? We had a summer school on migration. And I also remember vividly we discussed like the legal issues and we discussed like the political issues, but health was not such a big topic in these days. And now a year after we see a totally different development, and I'm very happy that we're kind of continuing this, that we're continuing in our network. Like we are like about 19 DRD centers worldwide, and I think the connection between Porto Alegre and Haifa is very strong and becoming stronger despite the pandemic and despite that we despite online webinar followed by many others on this topic, and thanks also for Danni and Tatiana for the initiative. And now I hand to Marcela.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you today. I would like to thank on behalf of the students the presence of Catarina, Tatiana, and Danni here with us. So let me introduce you our speakers of today. Tatiana Squeff is a permanent professor of the postgraduate program in law. She also holds a tenure track position as professor of international law at Federal University of Uberlândia. She's a Brazilian expert appointed by the Ministry of Justice, Senacom, to the Hague Conference on Private International Law in the Tourism Project. She's a PhD in international law from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, with a study period at the University of Ottawa. She holds a master in law by the Unicinos, and she also has advanced studies in refugees and public international law by the York University and Hague Academy. And Danni, very welcome. Danni Reches holds a BA in Middle Eastern Studies from Leiden University, also a BA certificate in Peace and Conflict Studies, and an MA in Diplomacy Studies from the University of Haifa. Currently, Danni is a PhD fellow at Haifa Center for German and European Studies, her dissertation focused on Netherlands of persons with a migration background from manner of religion, and she looks into parliamentary debates of two countries to see what those discourse was reflected in policy making regard to migration and integration. Okay, so let's the lecture begin. Please, Danni, you may start your speech.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction, and also thank you very much for organizing this. New article, which is those who couldn't stay home during the corona crisis, asylum seekers and emergency measures in EU member states, Germany and Greece. So there we go. If the slide works with me, at least. Yeah, there we go. All right. During the corona pandemic, the hashtag stay home became popular on social media. But in this presentation, I want to talk about those who were not able to stay home. Mobility is essential for asylum seekers, and so I was interested in what happened to these persons during the pandemic when most states actually curbed mobility. So my research question in the article is, how did European Union member states, Germany and Greece, react to the corona pandemic with regard to asylum? And what was this response in line with regional and international law? Unfortunately, in this PowerPoint, not all of the bullet points show one by one, but they all come at once. And I need to see if yeah, I got it right here. This program is new to me, so bear with me a little bit. It's the right slide. Okay. So the EU is the focus of this research because its member states are party to international treaties that are related to asylum and also EU law that refers to those treaties. Now, what do I mean with an asylum seeker? An asylum is understood in most member states as an applicant for international protection following the adaptation of the Recast Qualification Directive and the Recast Asylum Procedures Directive. Exceptionally, in Germany, in addition to these two directives, the term asylum seeker is used to include those in the national legislation, namely in Article 16a of the German Basic Law. In order to answer the question, what I call corona measures with regard to asylum seekers are analyzed and compared to international law that are relevant to asylum, and then also compared to regional law. And here I have a list on the side with what treaties I have looked in exactly. Next slide. The case studies, as I've mentioned, that I've selected are Greece and Germany for a few reasons. Firstly, of course, are member states of the EU, but their geographical position makes their border and asylum policy focus on very different aspects. Greece is an external border member state, while Germany lies at the heart of the EU. Then both have experienced a large influx of asylum seekers during the preceding so-called refugee crisis, and the member states still dealt with the consequences of that refugee crisis when the corona pandemic started. In the first part of this presentation, I'm going to talk about Germany, and then I'm going to continue with Greece, after which a conclusion will follow. So let's kick off with Germany. While it's loading, yeah. My analysis of Germany's corona measures starts on March 11th, when the World Health Organization characterized the coronavirus as a pandemic. One of the first measures that Germany took to stop the spreading of the virus was following the advice of the European Commission. On March 16th, the EC recommended a temporary 30-day restriction of any non-essential travel from third countries into the EU. Germany implemented this, and the restriction was later extended to May 15th. On March 22nd, the German government started implementing a set of national measures to reduce the amount of infections, and these measures included what I have here on this slide. And these are things that we've seen almost everywhere, right? So reduce social contact, social distancing, restaurants and cafes closed. And these measures were originally to remain in place for 2 weeks. However, on April 1st, Chancellor Angela Merkel announced an extension until April 19th, which meant that the measures would be in place during the Easter holiday and spring break. Another 2 weeks later, the measures were updated again. On April 20th, small retailers and schools were to reopen. Another update was then planned for April 30th, and this is where my analysis stops, because this is when I submitted the article. So now that I've provided you with the corona measures in Germany, I'm going to dig into them deeper and see if these complied to international and regional law. I'm going to start with the travel restrictions that were recommended by the European Commission. The first document is that is called the communication. And this is a document that has the restriction of non-essential travel from third countries into the EU explained. So the travel restrictions, I'm sorry, this is all on the screen in one go. In my original presentation, it came out one by one, but we'll get through it together. So I'm now with number 1. The travel restrictions did not apply to EU citizens, citizens of non-EU but Schengen countries, and long-term non-EU national residents for the purpose of returning home. The travel restrictions did then also not apply to persons who had an essential function or a need to travel. The following persons, among others, fall in the category of persons with an essential function. So here you should think of people who are healthcare professionals, elderly care providers, transport personnel, diplomats, and military personnel. And then lastly, we have the need-based group of people who are allowed to travel, and these were passengers in transit, passengers traveling for imperative family reasons, and lastly, persons in need of international protection or for other humanitarian reasons. Now, this last group, of course, is relevant for my research because by including this group, the communication included asylum seekers as persons who were not to be refused any entry at the external borders of the European Union because they had this essential need to travel. Interestingly enough, that's where we continue, the UN institutions such as the UNHCR and the International Organization for Migration took an opposing approach. They stopped refugee resettlement procedures completely on March 17th out of concern for the exposure of refugees to corona. The German government decided on March 18, the next day, to follow the example of the UN, instead of considering how to best implement the continued entry of third country nationals that the communication had allowed them to. Through these resettlement schemes, Germany had taken in around 5,000 refugees a year since 2012, and now the Interior Ministry had announced it halted all resettlement programs. This approach of implementing a stop of refugee resettlement programs was different than the approach that Germany had back in 2015 during the so-called refugee crisis. Back then, Merkel had stated that people fleeing war were welcome in Germany, and this was labeled an open-door policy. This was followed by criticism by European leaders and German opposition parties, and that made the policy become more restricted, but it was not significantly changed. The German decision to stop taking in refugees in 2020 now, therefore, was, if not surprising, at least a drastic measure and a turning point in German asylum policy. This shift in German policy, however, does not break any laws or regulations, right? Resettlement of refugees is not required by international law, but it's also not an obligation, even during a pandemic, to stop resettlement, according to the communication of the EU. It was even the European Commission itself an initiative to relocate unaccompanied children from Greece to other member states in early March. Only 10 member states took part in this scheme, including Germany, where 47 minors landed on April 18th. And this example exactly indicates that halting refugee resettlement programs was not a necessity. Following the communication on March 30th, the EC came with guidelines for how to implement the travel restrictions. And these guidelines were described in a document called the Guidance. In this guidance, more details were added to the part where asylum seekers were mentioned as an exception to the travel restrictions. So the communication spoke only about that first sentence, persons in need of international protection or for other humanitarian reasons. And then the guidance added to that exact sentence, respecting the principle of non-refoulement. Now, the norm of non-refoulement imposes an obligation on states not to return asylum seekers to countries in which their lives or freedom would be threatened. An important find after analyzing the text of the guidance is what I did not find. The guidance, just like the communication, did not make it mandatory for Germany to stop resettling refugees. Until now, we have discussed the corona measures that Germany implemented regarding traveling to the country, and now I want to go into some of the measures that affected asylum seekers who were already inside of Germany. When the corona measures were in place, the German Federal Office for Migration and Refugees suspended personal hearings with asylum applicants because it wanted to minimize contact to not spread COVID-19. As the asylum procedures were halted, asylum seekers were provided with temporary residence permits. And this is very important information because this means that persons were still able to exercise their right to seek asylum, and these measures were therefore in line with international law. A concern that many people had lay in the fact that most initial reception centers in Germany have quite a few people living together. On March 11th, the Interior Ministry of the state Baden-Württemberg announced that an asylum seeker was tested positive for the virus in a center in Heidelberg. This particular center was located in a former living quarter of the US military and was able to host about 1,300 asylum seekers. The decision to quarantine asylum seekers upon the confirmation of corona can be viewed as a result of measures that also applied to non-asylum seekers. And therefore, Germany complied with regional and international regulations, as written on the bottom of the slide, that protect minorities from being singled out. So on a concluding note about the case study of Germany, it can be said that Germany's corona measures were in line with international and regional laws when it comes to asylum seekers. The remarkable finding of the analysis is that asylum policy was restricted more than necessary during the pandemic. And this was a break with the open door approach during the former refugee crisis. Now, let's quickly move on to Greece. Greece is an appropriate case study as it forms an outer border of the EU and thus an entry point for many who seek protection within it. And this became obviously very clear during the so-called refugee crisis that peaked in 2015 when over 1.3 million asylum seekers entered the EU. On this slide, it only shows the numbers, particularly for Greece. An important step taken by the EU that helped curb this influx of asylum seekers to Greece was the EU-Turkey deal. An important aspect of this deal was that Greece was now allowed to return irregular migrants to Turkey. The deal was not only triggered by the hardship that Greece faced, but also followed threats that were made from the Turkish side to open the door for asylum seekers to leave Turkey altogether. Negotiations took place knowing that if the EU would not concede to Turkey's demands, it would face the consequences of an even larger than already great amount of arrivals. And this problematic position the EU was in made it recognize Turkey as a safe country of return for asylum seekers, despite increasing human rights violations by government. A few years after the Turkey deal was concluded, refugee camps in Greece that were created as temporary facilities were still in use. Overcrowding, insufficient provision of services, violence, and lack of security have been reported. Especially on Greek islands, reception conditions may have reached the level of inhumane or degrading treatment in certain cases. And the situation became even more dire when a new rise in the number of arrivals was measured by the end of 2019, so just recently. In response to this increase, on February 26th of this year, 2020, the Greek parliament voted to suspend access to asylum to all persons arriving to Greece between March 1st and 31st, which could then possibly be extended. Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis announced that he was involving Article 78.3 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, or the TFEU, when Parliament suspended asylum. His government, however, must have overlooked the part of this article that requires a proposal from the European Commission that is agreed upon by member states in order to make his government decision a legal one. Following the Greek vote, Ylva Johansson, who is the EU Commissioner for Home Affairs and in charge of EU migration policy, said that the Commission did not plan to invoke this clause of the TFEU. Now, this Greek decision led to three important issues. First of all, the requests for protection were not registered. Secondly, asylum seekers were held in detention. And eventually, these people were deported. Now, why are these things issues? The first issue regards the right to asylum. The term here means protection offered to an alien because the alien faces a threat abroad by the host state of that alien within the host state's territory. International documents that regard the right to asylum are, amongst others, the one I've written here on the slide. And the common interpretation of these documents is that while a person has the right to seek asylum, the right of asylum in itself is not explicitly stated. So by suspending asylum, Greece violated the right to seek asylum. Now, the second issue is that with detaining asylum seekers. Article 31.1 of the Geneva Convention prohibits host countries to punish refugees just for coming into the country or to be there when they present themselves to authorities or police without any delay and also prove that they have a good reason for coming in. Now, the UNHCR has provided guidelines on any alternatives to detention that also refer to the Geneva Convention. But the EU law sets a much more stringent standard. Whether Greece had and continues to break international law, while it is following EU law by detaining asylum seekers in some cases, is therefore open to debate. Nevertheless, detaining every new arrival, so everyone who comes in, for the reason of just having entered Greek territory, is not in line with the EU directive, which lays down standards for the reception of applicants for international protection in the EU. Thus, detaining all new arrivals goes against both international and regional law. The last point was that of the deportation of asylum seekers. So here we have Article 33 of the Geneva Convention that prohibits the expulsion of refugees, which is also referred to as refoulement. Although there are some exceptions, scholars insist that the principle of non-refoulement has become binding as a matter of both treaty and customary law. If Greece really deports all arrivals without checking whether they could be recognized as a refugee back to the territory they fled from, Greece violates this principle of non-refoulement. Mind you that all of this happened before Corona was announced a pandemic by the WHO. It was exactly on that same day that the Greek parliament suspended asylum, on February 26th, that the first case of Corona was confirmed in Greece. One day later, on the 27th, the Turkish government announced that it would no longer stop any asylum seekers from leaving Turkey to reach the EU. Turkey now hosted 3.6 million Syrian refugees, and since December 2019, hundreds of thousands more had tried to flee towards the closed Turkish border with Syria, where conflict was ongoing. The Turkish government said that it could simply not cope with increasing numbers, and that it would let them continue to Europe. As a result of this announcement, thousands of people traveled to the Greek-Turkey border, and in response, the Greek government reinforced its border with police and army, and thousands had now stranded in a no-man's land on the border. Reports of the Greek response to the opening of the Turkish border included what we call pushbacks. Pushbacks are the stopping of asylum seekers at a border and forcing them to return to the country they came from. There's footage available that shows Greek coast guards firing into the sea, as you can see on these images, near a small rubber boat, shoving it around and attempting to force it back to Turkey. Now, a grey area is entered when Greece engages in pushbacks. On the one hand, there's a European Court of Human Rights ruling of 2012 that Italy's pushbacks policy on boat refugees who came from Libya breached international law. On the other hand, you have to understand that the EU, since the signing of the EU-Turkey deal, as a safe country to return asylum seekers to, even though scholars have voiced a strong concern about defining Turkey as such. News coverage of this whole situation on the border, however, was soon overlooked as a result of the spread of the coronavirus globally. So when the corona came in on March 11th, Greece announced some nationwide measures to prevent the virus from spreading that are very common, and we've seen in other countries, also in Germany. Just in Greece, we also saw a mandatory 14-day self-quarantine after traveling. And the most drastic measure was that of a curfew throughout the whole of Greece from March 23 to April 27. Violators were fined with 150 euros, and the curfew took place during Orthodox Easter. And on April 23rd, the measure was extended to May 4th. Greece also had particular measures that would only count for asylum seekers. And these related mostly to those asylum seekers who were in the initial reception centers, or what we call refugee camps. But these measures actually, just like in the German case, also applied to non-asylum seekers. So they were non-discriminatory and in line with international and regional law. Now I'm going to April, which is the last little bit I have to say about Greece. On April 1st, the month-long suspension of asylum that Greece had decided upon back in February came to an end. But access to asylum this time was affected by suspension of the Greek asylum services. So they didn't work, so no one was able to seek asylum until at least April 10, which was this time justified by the pandemic. The initial decision to suspend asylum was not in accordance with international law, and the decision to extend the suspension due to Corona also breached those regulations. Remember that the communication and the guidance of the European Commission that I talked about in the German case specifically allows asylum seekers to enter the EU, and that it urged member states to uphold the principle of non-refoulement during the pandemic. So on the next day, on April 2nd, the first coronavirus infections were confirmed among residents of these refugee camps, and they were placed on the quarantine as well. The overcrowded centers are potential areas of disease outbreaks, and the Greek government is very aware of this danger, and they have pleaded for larger resettlement programs within the EU. And my analysis here has shown that this is actually possible, and also in accordance with international and regional law, even during a pandemic. So lastly, it's interesting to note that on April 10, the Greek government announced an extension of the suspension of asylum services until May 15th. And that's where my analysis stopped. It might be interesting for you, though, to know, I don't want to leave you hanging, that the suspension did end on May 15th, but then it was only put back in place on May 18th. Human Rights Watch has now reported that the Greek asylum system is working again since June 5th. And now I have my last slide. I hope I can just go quickly over the conclusions. Some time left. So, as you now know, Germany's measures to prevent the spreading of COVID-19 were in compliance with international and regional regulation. Also, the German government restricted movement of asylum seekers and refugees more than it was obliged to during the pandemic, which implies a turn to stricter asylum policy. Regarding Greece, we now know that it went against internationally agreed upon regulations when it suspended the right to seek asylum. And this decision was made prior to the pandemic, but then during the pandemic, COVID-19 was used as another excuse to extend the practice. Why is all of this important? Greece's violations will have major implications not only for asylum seekers, but also for other member states that might have similar intentions and now believe that they will face no deterrence. And it is imperative that the community that claims it is based on the principle of solidarity, that it increases its resettlement programs in order to leave no one behind. And that's it for today, from my side at least. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and rich presentation about a very serious and I will say a little sad use of international law as a shield to change long-standing policies, especially in the German case. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really very rich for our students. And now I we'll give the floor for our second presenter to present the Brazilian case. Professor Tatiana, please, and stay there for the questions, please, Danni.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me properly? I do need that someone allows my presentation from the other.
Yes, Tatiana, I already did that. We just have a little echo from your voice. Oh, because you are twice logged in. Try to turn off one, and then I think we're gonna be good to go.
Now? Can you hear me? Okay. I think now it's better. I am uploading the presentation. Just a second, please.
Okay, no problem. Take your time, Professor Tatiana. And if you need any help, just let us know.
It's not working. Perhaps Marcela can share your screen?
Yes.
No, I am uploading the presentation because that was a screen sharing and now I am processing the presentation.
Okay, let's try like that. Yeah, now it's perfect, Professor Tatiana.
Okay, so hello everyone. I would like first to thank Professor Claudia for arranging this conference along with the Haifa Center in name of Katarina, who is a great pleasure to see once more as we met in December, just as Danny, to share another panel with you. It's a great honor. Well, my presentation will focus on the Brazilian perspective on how Brazil is treating migrants. And in order to do so, it is important to highlight how was the reality of migrants in Brazil just before the pandemic, in order for us to see how the pandemic really affected the reality of migrants within Brazil. So it is important to say that Brazil is not a usual destination within Latin America. It is actually the last country in Latin America to receive migrants. Being the first, actually Suriname, followed by Chile, by Argentina, by Venezuela. Brazil is not considered to be an usual destination. It is often seen as a territory of passage. Migrants come to Brazil and then they just move on to other directions. And why does that happen? Because of language. Portuguese, it's quite hard for migrants when compared to Spanish, precisely because the number of migrants we receive within Latin America is often from Spanish speaking countries, so they find it difficult to come to Brazil. Not only that, it's difficult for migrants to find formal job positions within the market. So this is another difficulty that normally bars migrants from choosing Brazil as a destination. Those who actually established in Brazil, wants to be in Brazil, they find it difficult to have access to documents, such as having their situation regularized. Not only that, they also find it difficult to have access to public service, even though it is prescribed under Brazilian law that they have access to diverse rights, from civil to social to economic rights. The only right which is not allowed directly to migrants is the political right. However, all the other rights are prescribed under Brazilian legislation that migrants should be entitled to, but they find it difficult to access those services, mainly housing, healthcare, and education. Not only that, it is important to say that within Brazil, normally migrants find it difficult to have sufficient income to provide for the families and for their household. And what happens is that then they turn into informal activities in order to improve their income within their household. And when I say informal activities, I mean that they are normally freelancers, they cook food to sell, they teach classes from their languages, and they provide services on demand, not having particular income or solid income monthly, which would make them able to survive properly within the country. So at the end, before the pandemic, we could say that in Brazil, migrants normally face a lot of unemployment. Formal job positions is not available to them, and they're often underpaid. So they're paid less than Brazilian individuals. Well, following that, we have a new reality imposed by COVID-19 pandemic. And what is this new reality imposed? Well, as Danni said in her presentation, social distancing is something that affects directly migrants because they then used to work in informal activities such as cooking and such as teaching languages, as I said before. And these activities has been stalled because of the pandemic, because of social distancing. Therefore, their income is largely affected. Not only that, reduction of salary and working hours is also a problem among those migrants which are indeed with a formal job position. So they're either laid off or they're having their salary reduced to a basic wage, which cannot cover their family household expenses. Therefore, what we see is that those who had a position, a formal position, are becoming unemployed. They are being subjected to abuse and exploitation in labor. They're having terrible conditions, and they're not having access to water, to food, and even housing properly because of eviction, which is being carried on in several cities within Brazil, because they cannot pay for their maintenance either by housing or any other sort of basic services. And some of them have even manifested the intention, their desire to return to their homeland. Precisely Venezuelan, there's a group of more than 40,000 Venezuelans who have been expressing their desire to return home, even though home would be in a position that would be in a worse scenario, or just as worse as the ones that they're living in Brazil, however, would be their homeland. So this is the new reality imposed by COVID-19 to migrants within Brazil. And then we come to what Brazil is doing to provide an answer for this situation. Well, the first answer is providing them with a Corona voucher. Corona voucher would be an amount provided monthly. Actually, it's not monthly, but actually in 3 months, April, May, and June, which would be of 600 reais, which amounts to about a little less than 100 euro, which would be made available by the government. But the fact that this Corona voucher is not only made available to migrants, but also to Brazilian nationals, because in accordance to our Constitution, Article 5, we cannot impose any discrimination between nationals and migrants. Therefore, there's a need to provide these Corona voucher to everyone in need in accordance to Federal Law 13982 of 2020. So they have to have the same, to fill the same requirements as Brazilians do. They have to be over 18 years old, 18 years of age. They need to have an income that does not exceed 86 euro a month. They need to have a taxable income below 4,671 euro in 2018, and some other requirements, just as Brazilians. So this would be a positive idea or a positive feedback in order to try making that scenario, that fragility, that vulnerability that migrants were facing in Brazil actually into something at least a little bit better. But what we see is that migrants are not having access to this Corona voucher. Although the law prescribes that they have the right to have access to that, although Federal Law 1340/45, which is Brazilian migration law, prescribes particularly the need to provide migrants with social benefits, they are not having access to this Corona voucher. And why they're not having this this access? Because of the documentation they present. There's a need for one to accede to this Corona voucher, is to present their social security documentation properly, which is called CPF in Brazil. And what we see is that many migrants have an inconsistent data in the system. Either their family name is wrong, either their members of their family are not properly inserted in the system, so they are not being able to have access to this Corona voucher. Not only that, the federal government said, okay, so if you need to correct those data, you may access it through this link, and they just provide a link which is in Portuguese and online for migrants, which is also problematic because it is in Portuguese, and we have many migrants that are not familiar still with Portuguese, so they need help in order to fill these blanks. And another problem is that many migrants face digital exclusion. So they do not have a way to correct the data in the system in order to ascend to the Corona voucher. And even because of that, in my university, we have a clinic in order to provide assistance to migrants, judicial assistance to migrants. And we have made a folder, a brochure, so that we made available in Portuguese, in Arabic, in Spanish, in French, in other languages, which are the migrants we've seen in the city, and which is the flyer you can see on the left side of the slide. And we made available in many places in Uberlândia in order to make them at least aware of their rights and how to correct the data, even though in this time of social distancing. Well, not only that, we see other problems is that, okay, those that correct the data in the system, when they are having their data checked, there is also other two issues that they are facing. First, that authorities say that they need to be regularly prescribed or inserted within the system. So therefore, if they're not regular migrants in Brazil, they cannot ascend to this Corona voucher, which is wrong because of the Federal Law 13445 of 2017, which Brazil's following the Inter-American Court of Human Rights precedent said that, okay, you cannot criminalize the migrant because of their social or their regularity within the country. Therefore, even though the law says you cannot discriminate if they're irregular, the authorities are saying that, no, we're not providing because you're not regularly within Brazil. Not only that, they are not accepting the documents if they are outdated or if they are foreign documents presented by the migrant, which is also something that the law is actually not requiring for providing the corona voucher, because actually the federal police, which is the one who regularized the migrants within Brazil, is not seeing them since February 24th. So they extended the dates in order for the migrants to have their documents to be considered valid until the end of the pandemic. So the problem is that they corrected their information in the system, and therefore they're still denied because the authorities do not know what the law prescribes. So this is something that impairs them for having access to that €100 per month in Brazil. And this is actually turns into a conclusion that we can say that this become an abusive and a discriminatory barrier to providing migrants their rights, which are under the law within Brazil. Even though the idea is good, the idea is to provide equally Brazilians and migrants the same rights, having a minimum wage in order for them to go through this social distancing period. However, they have been discriminated, and these prescriptions from the authorities are seen as a point of concern within Brazil. Well, because of that, even we have the Federal Public Defender's Office filing a civil public action in order to try providing them this access. However, this has not had any solution until now. So it is June. They should be receiving the third €100, but they are not receiving because the civil suit has no decision yet. So this is something of concern. And a second aspect within Brazil that we have been taking into consideration is the proposal of many bills in order to address this migrant situation during the pandemic. The first bill that I would like to highlight is Bill 2699 of 2020. This bill was proposed by Fernanda Melchiona. And this bill is intended to provide the regularity of migrants within Brazil. So this bill is supposed to say that the migrants should be received, should be regularized under the humanitarian reception prescription. This humanitarian reception prescription has been used before within Brazil to Syrians, to Haitians, and to Venezuelans. And this bill intends to provide migrants that so request this regularization, which then would make them available or fit for the corona voucher, as I mentioned before. So this bill would help them to access that corona voucher. Another aspect of this bill, which is also important, and that is to issue instructions to Caixa Bank, which is the bank through which the federal government is giving the corona voucher to the population itself. So they would instruct the bank that these migrants have the right to receive the corona voucher. And another aspect is that it also prescribes for the issuance of guidance to the healthcare system for them not to ask migrants of their situation in Brazil regarding their the usage of hospitals and public health system. A migrant in order to have access to it. So this is very interesting in this aspect, because the law would have a positive outcome, that society would know the rights of migrants already provided within federal law, but they would actually make it more visible for them to have access either to the corona voucher or to access to the public health system which is something that some migrants are afraid of doing because of their regulatory situation. Not only that, some other bills that have been discussed in Brazil is bill number 783, proposed in the Senate, and bill number 885 to guarantee basic service to migrant consumers, but to the population itself. Not only migrants, but the consumers, being Brazilian or not, would be also affected by this bill. And what does those two bills prescribe? They prohibit the interruption of supply of public service, such as electricity, telephone, gas, water and sewage, and also internet, as Bill 783 also prescribes. So this would be very interesting, because even though they're not being paid, then it cannot be actually cut by the providers. So these bills actually are imperative to fight and to prevent coronavirus, especially from the aspect that it prohibits the aspect actually affect migrants in stop coronavirus to actually infect them. This aspect, although they have not been yet debated in Congress, those two bills have had a positive outcome, because they have influenced some municipalities and some states in the federation in order to provide local and state laws that prohibit those cuts, especially of water and sewage, those two public services. States of Santa Catarina and Paraná are example of the positive effect that the proposal of those two bills have created, which is actually a positive side within Brazil in order to fight this exclusion migrants are facing. So it is important also to say, to highlight actually the last bill I want to talk to you about today, which is bill number 1179, which has already been discussed in Congress and which has already been transformed into federal law number 14010 of 2020. Why does this bill is being handed to actually to ban eviction? Before the pandemic, 90%, over 90% of migrants were in Brazil living in rented housing. And if they do not have income, they cannot afford or they cannot pay their housing bill, their rent over the month. So these bills, 1179, had a prescription under Article 9 that would say, okay, eviction is now banned until October of this year. And then this would be actually helpful to migrants in order for them to have a roof under their head until now we have more. We know what the pandemic, the population is. And one of the vetoes made by the president of Brazil was Article 9 that banned eviction. So instead of making it work, instead of helping migrants and the society itself, which has been affected by the coronavirus of social distancing and not having income, the president chose to veto this Article 9. So this would be a problem, because then the whole point of this, at least this part of the bill, would be ruined. So we come into three main conclusions, and then I turn into the last part of my presentation, which is Brazil a model to be followed in regard to the treatment of migrants during the pandemic? So as Danni posed the question before her presentation, I'm posing the question at the end of my presentation after having had a thought about these movements and these bills that have been proposed within Brazil. And first, regarding equal treatment, Brazil is not a model to be followed because actually, the Constitution prescribes equal treatment, even though migration law of 2017 prescribes equal treatment, even though the Inter-American Court of Human Rights prescribes equal treatment, and Brazil is bound by those precedents created under the OAS system, we are not seeing it in practice, as we have impediments of providing the Corona voucher for migrants. They have been largely excluded for receiving this Corona voucher, especially in the region where we are working in Uberlândia. But in the second part, regarding the basic services, is Brazil a model to be followed? I tend to say yes, at least the bills we proposed, especially bills that prescribes for migrant consumers to have access to electricity, to gas, to telephone, to internet, and to water and sewage, which is definitely important during this time of pandemic. I say that these normative proposals are, yes, a model to be followed. Maybe this could actually be used in other countries in order to help provide migrants with a better solution. And a third point is that the right to housing. As I just mentioned, that we had a veto under the ban of eviction. It happened on June 11th, 2020. And according to Brazilian laws, we have a period of 30 days, so until July 11th, 2020, for the Congress maybe to overrule this veto made by the president. So we still have a shot of having this eviction law overruled, this veto over the ban of eviction overruled until July 11th this year. So I still don't know if this would be a model to be followed if our Congress actually overturns the veto, or this would not be a model to be followed if indeed the Congress does not do anything in order to prevent evictions regarding housing to migrants. So with this, I ended my analysis of how Brazil is treating migrants during this time of pandemic. I thank the group for having prepared this the seminar in name of Professor Claudia and Professor Katrina. It is a pleasure to be here again, and along with you, Danny. Thank you all for the attention.
Thank you, Tatiana. In reality, that would be the part where everybody's clapping hands. It's working in this setting. It's very interesting that we have this kind of comparison, right? That Danni went first with Germany, and you presented, and Greece, and you presented as the case of Brazil, because what we hear a lot nowadays is the claim of the virus is attacking everyone. The virus doesn't know borders. It is kind of all human and global pandemic, which is true. But what we often keep forgetting that there are much vulnerable groups in each society or in each country, and that you really well pointed it out, that these groups of the migrants in Brazil, they are the vulnerable groups, right? They are affected as any other people by the virus, but they have much less access to healthcare, and there is kind of like a fake or sugary like healthcare that a Bolsonaro government could say, you see here, we're providing them something, but if you take a deeper look on analysis that you did, you really uncover like how flat this health is. So I really liked your presentation, and I think like I'm coming from political science, so for us we always look into this pandemic also not just as a health crisis but also into a political crisis, and we compare how different governments react to it. So I think this leads us to a very nice discussion. We open the floor for questions. Please type the questions. You have the public chat, so everybody can type questions, and Maria and Marcella will read them out, and maybe we collect a bundle of questions and then we give back to you, Danni and Tatiana, because we are a bit limited in time. We can take another 15 to 20 minutes for the Q&A.
I want also to thank both presentations. It was really very interesting. And also to welcome our colleagues from the 2019 International School on Migration, Anya Benedict, Abraham Johannes, Larissa Muasili, Laila Moliterno, Matrix Esker, Francisca Wolf, Matteo Finco, and all the others that I could not name. But it's very nice to have you here. And perhaps you can also make a presentation for us and connect us with your center in the future. Let's see if Marcela can read aloud, or Maria. Maria is also here. Marcela, please.
Hello, everyone. I don't see any questions. I don't know if the students are shy, but please send the questions. We are here for the debate now.
I have a question to Danni, if I may begin the floor. I was very interested in this directive that you spoke, and I must say I'm not aware about this European standards. It's a directive from 2013, 33 director. Could you explain a little more about these standards, European standards, please?
Yes, it's actually a good question, and I'm sure that if I don't know the answer, that Maria can help me, because she studied the CEAS, or the Common European Asylum System, that regulates anything about asylum seekers and migrants within the European Union. I have to open my notes again to see indeed from when it was, but the last set of directives was accepted in 2013. So most of the regulations in the European Union stem from that time, from 2013, which is right before the refugee crisis hit in 2015. So the directive that I spoke about when I was talking about the Greek halting of the seeking asylum, that's what you asked, right? Which specific one was it? Because there's quite a few directives, but the one I mentioned was specifically about standards for the reception of applicants for international protection in the EU, which is Directive 2013/33 of the EU. Yeah, so in that it mentions that there are only a few reasons that are reasonable that allow a state to detain an asylum seeker. So detaining an asylum seeker means really putting it in a place where it is then where the person is then not allowed to leave anymore. This could be a prison facility, but it could also be a reception center that is closed off for anyone to leave. The general idea is that a refugee camp or a reception center is really open, and that refugees or asylum seekers usually want to stay there because there they have access to all kinds of services that otherwise they wouldn't have, or at least a tent, not even a roof over their heads. But they are free to leave those places. That's the rule in international law, and that's also set in this particular directive. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you very much. I want also to thank Professor Augusto Jäger and Professor Marcelo Duque that are here with us, and also from the Minister of Justice, Dr. Augini Romano is with us, that spoke in the 2019 International School on Migration. I don't know if the students have questions now, Marcela. If not, I have a question for...
Let me check, Professor Claudia. Anyone? Questions?
I would have a question for Tatiana, maybe. So I like it's a very short question, and maybe it goes good in a comparison to Germany. Namely, in Germany, we had now a big outbreak of coronavirus in a slaughtering house, and we had there mainly work migrants who were like, it was 1,000 cases, people from Poland tested, and I know that in Brazil, also like especially in the south, a lot of migrants are working in the meat industry. Do you have comparable cases? Do you also have problems there in the slaughterhouses that you know about that are discussed in public?
Tatiana, you hear the question? I don't think so. If not, I may answer. Yes, we have the same problems because of a lot of migrants are Muslims, and we have a big industry, meat industry here in South, and especially in these cities, we have an outbreak of coronavirus, and so we don't make a differential treatment for the foreign people or migrants and the others. But I know that in these 4 cities in the interior of Rio Grande do Sul, we have the same problems. I don't know specifically why, but in these plants of that work with meat, we have a lot of problems. I don't know if Tatiana is again there.
Hello, I am.
Okay, then you can. We don't see you now.
Sorry, sorry, I'm not sure if somebody could type or maybe, and then I can try to answer it.
Okay, no problem. I answer your question.
Okay, I'm sorry. My internet here, I couldn't understand, and I had to log in again.
No problem, no problem. I have another question for also for Katerina. It was very interesting what Danni said, that perhaps you can follow or be in line with international law and also make something that is not very nice or perhaps is too hush, too quick. And I don't know if there are a principle in international law that can help us. You mentioned the principle of solidarity, but we can develop something like in constitutional law. They have mass that say you make too much or you did not make what is needed. So I don't know in English this specific, perhaps Marcelo Duque can help me or Augusto. In German, they say that you are not proportional in your response. You left something behind, or someone, or you make too much, that it was really not needed. Perhaps we can speak about these limits that are not that are in line with international law, but could be better if we work in this.
Right, should I start maybe? Well, this principle of solidarity is really something that the EU in its constitution says that it's one of its basic principles. Like the reason that there is an EU at all is because all of these countries together want to make the world a better place, right? Like they are solidary, they want to do things together, and that will also make the EU as a whole stronger, which only works if all of them want to be in it together. And Katarina has actually written an article for a newspaper, right, Katarina? Just at the beginning of the whole pandemic lockdown. I'm not sure if she's able to hear us.
No, I hear you. I unmuted myself. I would go in the same direction. I just wanted to let you finish you answering, Danny, because I would go in the same direction. It's an op-ed article in the news, like in the newspaper The Hill, and it's talking exactly about European solidarity and this question. If this is the stress test for European solidarity, right? And Danny, you know the legal background now much better than me, but all the political contracts, right, in the European Union, they always state that this is a value, we want to have it, and we want to have solidarity to everyone. What you were referring to, Professor Claudia, the Verhältnismäßigkeit, right, like the proportion or being proportional in the law. It also counts for the EU, but I think here we can see, especially in the European Union, how fragile this whole political construct we have is, because we don't have any clear regulations, and we have always recommendations or guidelines, but they are not very helpful. Maybe Danny, I give back to you, and you can reflect a bit more. Did you find any legal basis or any really strong legal grounds on this topic?
You're asking me if I found any legal basis that could support the principle of solidarity within the European Union? Well, actually, the A directive, which is part of the Common European Asylum System, goes exactly in the opposite direction of the principle of solidarity, which is known as the Dublin Regulation. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. So the Dublin Regulation is a rule that the country where an asylum seeker arrives to first has to go over the application of asylum of this person. Of course, an asylum seeker who tries to illegally enter the European Union, because it's very difficult to do it through any other legal way, for example, by sea, from Libya into Italy, or from Turkey into Greece, you would always get to these external border countries. You can't take a boat from Turkey to Denmark, right? So Denmark would get much less first asylum applications than countries on the sea, on the Mediterranean do, such as Spain, Italy, and Greece. So these countries are basically, I mean, I don't know how to say it nicely, but the other northern countries of the European Union are not being solidary with these southern countries. And it causes a lot of problems for how the whole European asylum system works. So in asylum law, we actually see the opposite happening of the principle of solidarity.
Thank you very much. Marcelo, we have a question?
Yes, actually, Professor Tatiana got, I think, 3 questions, but she's having a technical problem, and she said she's gonna write the answer for us. So just let me check if we have other questions for Danny here. Let me read Maria's question. Okay, she's saying, the European Union has been finally supporting other refugees host countries to cope with the corona crisis, such as Jordan and Lebanon. Could you please comment on the measure to avoid the refugee influx to the European Union?
Okay, sometimes it's difficult because you break up a little bit, so I hope I understood the full question, and if not, I'll just try again.
Okay.
So there are, I had a presentation today, it was very interesting, I listened to, in which someone from a Belgian university spoke about the humanitarian corridor. So for example, Belgium is a country that opened a humanitarian corridor with countries such as Lebanon and Jordan. So they would have a direct line with refugee camps, local authorities, and organizations such as the UNHCR there to select people who would be the most vulnerable and suitable to integrate in Belgium, who would then be able to come on a plane and apply for refugee status in Belgium, which then would be highly likely for them to get because they're already pre-selected. This is something that was happening until the corona pandemic happened. These programs are part of what we call refugee resettlement programs. They were halted, which started really when the UNHCR itself and other UN institutions such as the IOM stopped all of these programs. And they said, we don't think it's responsible anymore to start moving people around to different countries, because then we're just gonna have this virus spread further and worse. It's difficult to say if they were right or not. I'm also not a doctor or anyone who knows anything about how viruses spread, and it's very difficult to say what is more important. I don't know that, but for Germany, I explained that there is to stop this, because laws and regulations that were in place already before Corona and also during Corona and during the pandemic allowed Germany to still take people, and also Belgium, to take these people from Jordan and from Lebanon after screening, after even giving them a Corona test. That's something they could have done before they would have been put on a plane to Europe. But altogether, these countries had decided to not do that, which was something that was not necessary, but didn't go against any regulations either. Is that an answer?
Yes, thank you very much, Danni. So we are getting close to 2:15. Let me see. Professor Tatiana, do you think you're going to be able to answer here at the chat? Or maybe, I don't know, if you want to choose one question to try to answer to us. But I'm afraid we only have a few minutes left.
Yes. I don't know if the colleague Dr. Kilian is there from the Center of European and German Studies here from Porto Alegre.
Yes, I'm here.
Please.
I'm here.
I will give the floor again to Katarina, to your last words, and then I think it's time to end this very beautiful moment that we got all together in this different way, but it was really a pleasure to see you, to hear you, and I think this subject is so important that we must remain studying and bring new ideas, and perhaps studying new suggestions to give to our countries. So thank you very much, Danni, Reches, and also Katarina and the Haifa Center for this wonderful moment. And I'm sure we'll be not the only one. We will have more discussion on this, because it's really important for these very vulnerable people, and to need our ideas and solutions for the future. So thank you very much in my name and from the students, and I give the floor to Katarina.
Thank you, Claudia, and thank you all the team behind, also Marcela, Maria, and especially our two speakers. I think because also we always have like this kind of technical problems, if anyone wants to approach us, Danni and me are very approachable via mail. You can join also our Facebook page, you can join our centers page, and we are trying to hold more seminars in this direction for the future. I want to announce already, as I see a lot of students also from the Brazilian Center, we were supposed to hold a study trip with the Brazilian Center, also on the topic of migration, as it won't take place, unfortunately, due to the travel restrictions. We will hold it virtually, and this is my gift for you, or my surprise for the evening. For us, it's already evening, right? Like Danni and me going to sleep soon. So we will do a virtual study trip, and I will circulate it, the information. I very warmly invite you to join. It will be at the end of July. We will adapt the time so that you can join us, and we
It's cutting a little. But thank you very much, Katarina. We are eager to know more about this virtual travel together with our two centers. Thank you very much. Danni, you want to say something before we close?
No, not really. Just a thanks to everyone for taking the time to be here tonight, or this afternoon for you guys.
Thank you very much. Tatiana, now you are back. You want to say a few words to close?
I would like to thank again for the opportunity of being here and presenting this thought with you. And I would like to apologize for everyone. My internet is going on and off today. I am sorry for this technical detail. But I'd like to thank Professor Claudia, Katarina, and Danni, and everyone who has been seeing our discussion today for the attention and for the space given to us, for us to share.
Thank you very much.
Our thoughts.
Thank you very much. Cristiane, you can close, please.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Claudia. And dear Danni, dear Tatiana, on behalf of the Center for German and European Studies here in Porto Alegre, Brazil, I want to thank you for this interesting panel. It was so important to discuss. And Katarina, I want to thank you for the comments and for the discussion too. And it was a great pleasure today to have you here with us from our sister center. And I'm so happy to see the names from the people from the migration workshop for last year. And it's a pity that we can meet each other personally, but the technical make it possible that you met like this here. And thank you again, Danni, Katarina, and Tatiana. And thank you, Marcela and Claudia, for and Maria too, for the organization. It was a great opportunity